So I was just listening to a podcast where they asked the question, how can we make a game that is engaging, that isn't about violence? And I was trying to think about that in terms of how we could use one to foster understanding. Each time I go to a national park or a state park and visit for the first time, I spend a lot of time trying to understand what is there, so that when I get there, I know what I'm encountering and I understand how I'm supposed to behave, my place in the environment. Students' places in the environment could be put into some sort of a game where they can better understand how the environment functions, the relationships of the trees and the plants and the rain, the environment, and instead of acting upon it, understand that when they do act, because they have to act just because they're present in it, what their actions mean for the environment and what they can do to mitigate their impacts on the environment by really going into depth levels within plants and the earth, understanding geological processes, and going from that surface level view one level at a time into the space to better understand what it is that's happening and how these life processes, geological processes, impact each other. So what's happening below the surface and the interrelationships of those systems. And so if they take a particular action, what are the cascading impacts of those choices that they make by just being in the environment? So the choice of packing out waste when they're out in the environment versus leaving their waste in the environment. The choice to bring an animal with them, like a dog, into the environment versus leaving them home. And not just the impacts on the environment itself, but also the other people who want to be in the environment. I listen to a lot of hiking and climbing podcasts, and there's a lot of debates about whether or not people should bring their dogs out there, because just bringing that dog can make somebody else have a really bad time if your dog isn't well behaved, or it can just pull them out of kind of the meditative state that they were seeking. And so your choice to have an experience negatively impacts somebody else's experience. So you could also go in either in the same game or a different game experience and do some perspective taking based on choices, so that especially if someone is having trouble understanding the impacts of their decisions on others around them, you could simulate entering the mind of another person. Basically, most video games take first-person perspective. This is how it impacts me. I understand my thinking, my choices, but you don't really get to enter the minds of the people around you and how your choices, what you say, what you do, impacts how they perceive you. So, and you could do it with bar graphs or something showing positive, negative feelings on a continuum or something, and then click on that bar and see what went into it, and even going back to see the memories and what that impact was generally on the person. And you could go into really highly specific percentages, but real world doesn't work that way. But you could just see what went into them feeling that way. And we do that with non-player characters and stuff in some video games, where, like the old Fable game, if you murder people nearby, everybody else starts to behave in a scared way, but you can't really see how they feel or what they feel. And that could be good for perspective taking, especially for folks that struggle to understand how other people perceive them, and just to give a model of how choices impact other people's relationships to the individual, so you can kind of jump into other people's perspectives and see what's going on. They did that a bit in a game that I was playing. I'm trying to remember what it is. It's on Xbox. It takes place, I think, in Tlingit culture up in Alaska. It's a sister and a trans brother, and they're trying to make sense of what happened. So they're trying to go back into that perspective, and they can kind of see each other's perspectives. So there's not a lot of violence. However, the choices that the brother and sister make in the game impact how other people react to them, but it's not transparent. So you could use the video game to make things more transparent if you're trying to teach those kinds of cognitive skills, so an educational game. But going back to the other, if you're trying to help people both experience the environment and understand what's happening, you can populate it with local plants and stuff so that people can understand medicinal uses, whether or not different plants are threatened, if they're native or invasive. And you can give people more information. They can learn about the environment and understand how different actions have taken place. You could show images of effectively what the historical environment looked like versus now, versus what it might look like in the future if current actions continue. There's a lot of ways that you could build a game where people are in the environment. They can understand how actions impact things. They could even model and simulate those things to give folks some agency and understanding towards maybe building a better world, or just understanding each other, which could also build a better social world. So these are just some things that I'm trying to think about in terms of how we could build better video games that aren't about violence. I've been playing with Unity, and two of the main options are all about having high agency first-person shooter and 2D scrolling shooter type. And they have the open world one that I need to play with and see if these kinds of things are possible. So there's another game that the guy who made one on the iPhone called Mountain made, where you're a zebra and you can go in and do different levels of being. I think it's called Being or something like that. You can become grass, but you move around, and that part of it doesn't make sense. And I think that was actually built in Unity. So there are some options and some things. I think having reality be part of this becomes important, because understanding how folks make decisions in the world, going from one street to the next, and understanding people's thought processes about even who they're voting for and what emotional components and past lived experiences lead to one person supporting one candidate versus another could be a pretty interesting political science thing. There's just a lot that we could do by modeling and not necessarily drawing conclusions for the player, but at least showing them how their choices impact things with what we do think we know. So that could be fun. I was just thinking about that, and we'll see what happens. But my environment, we had a lot of big rains. This is a creek that you can see parts of it are natural, and then further up and further down it's walled in. So understanding the choices of that, whether you wall stuff in or don't, whether you create a dam upstream or don't, and what those impacts are on wildlife and the local flora, stuff like that. There's just a lot you could do, and you could do it at a micro level or a macro level. I'd say you want to start at a micro level to see if you can actually give people an experience. And the podcast I was listening to was about Skyrim and that huge open world, and it may not make sense to start with a huge open world. Maybe it makes more sense to just start with this street and that creek over there, and how our decisions about making these wastewater systems impact the environment. There's a lot of things that we could do, but let someone just be and explore closely and quietly in a space without necessarily having to take agency in the game, but towards a goal of helping people take agency outside of a game could be interesting. So that's what I was thinking about.